A goal is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's hard to get anywhere if you don't know where you want to go. On the other hand, it's entirely possible to have a successful life without landing the one thing you've wanted forever. Now, does missing a goal like that make you a failure? Of course not. But it can change how you see what you did accomplish. Around 30 years ago, in middle school, I discovered a book called The Stainless Steel Carrot. It tells the true story of a racing driver once known and followed by thousands. John Morton got his start sweeping floors for the legendary Carroll Shelby, but he always wanted to get to the top, to open wheel, to Indy cars, possibly even to Formula One. Now, Morton made it to open wheel for a bit, but he didn't really see the top. He did, however, win SCCA championships and the 24 Hours of Le Mans twice. His time racing Datsun 510s and 240Zs is widely held up as the reason why America began to take Japanese performance cars seriously, and one specific race at Laguna Seca in '71 is still held up as one of the most emotional and consequential events in motorsport history. In spite of all that, Morton doesn't really seem to understand why he means so much to so many. He just seems to wish he had done more. In this podcast series, we examine what happens when things go wrong in the world of cars, what we learn when we fall down, how we use that knowledge to get better, and how getting back up helps make us who we are. I'm Sam Smith. I'm a journalist and a club racer, and I love stories. Welcome to Driven to Fail. Thanks for taking the time. Thanks for being here. This is... We were talking earlier. I am a giant nerd. I have a copy of Sylvia's book sitting on my desk. It usually sits on my bookcase. I've read it a zillion times. I read it in middle school a zillion times. I'm a B Sedan dork. I'm one of those really annoying people who you probably have talked to 1,000 times over the past 40 years because of those little cars. But I want to start with something else. We met very briefly at Laguna Seca this year during a vintage race weekend this fall. Mm-hmm. You were being honored there. Your Datsun 510 was there, the BRE car. A mutual friend was kind enough to introduce us. And one of the things that she told me later was that you sometimes find it odd to process what your time in certain cars means to people. And she said that you sort of view your career as kind of having, fizzled in certain ways, which I found absolutely amazing because that's ridiculous because it didn't. But as Alana put it, she said you were literally the guest of honor at a vintage racing event with your car on display, which means people remember you, which means you didn't fizzle at all. But we all have these moments of insecurity, right? Where we have to where our friends have to tell us that we're being ridiculous. How do you look at what you've done and have that moment of, I didn't quite go where I wanted to. It must not be a thing. How does that work in your head?
In my head, it works that just like you said, it's just, you devote your whole life to something, and when it's over, it's pretty much over. I'd still probably run a little nothing race maybe now and then, but for the most part, it's over. And then you can get a perspective. Is this where you wanted to get to, or did you fall short? Or, but the only way you can do that is to get it to be old enough that you can look back on your life with some perspective. And it's a compilation of everything that happened. And you say, was it enough? Or, I had the interesting thing at Monterey, the race you just talked about. I had an autograph session, and I'm sitting next to Mario Andretti. And next to Mario Andretti is, what's his two-time world champion? Mika Hakkinen, and on my left was Peter Brock. And I think, what are we doing here? Not so much Peter, but I had a funny feeling. What am I doing sitting next to Mario Andretti? And funny thing happened recently. I did one of these things sitting exactly where we are with Justin Bell, and he did me. He had all of his equipment, and I didn't have to do anything. I don't think there was a computer. It was face to face.
Yeah.
And I think he did me because the next week he had to go to Nazareth and do Mario Andretti, and I was cannon fodder. But, it came out really well. I haven't seen it, but I think it worked.
It's so funny, right? Because, there's an old line that goes something like comparison is the theft of joy, right? But anybody who's ever been an athlete, you have to compare yourself. And it's dangerous when you look at racing, because there's so many things that factor into it, right? It's not just you, it's not just the car, it's not just the day, it's not just the team, it's not just luck. And yet on some level, everybody comes back and goes, well, I'm not Mario. So what did I do? It's nothing, right?
Yeah.
It must be a strange moment. But one of the other things I find really interesting, even in spite of everything you just said, you have these amazing moments in your career where, you didn't say no, you got a shot, you stepped up and you took it. And, for people who don't know, so you grew up on the East Coast and you wanted to get into racing. So you dropped out of college, you headed to California, you went to Carroll Shelby's driving school. This is a pretty famous story, and it's in the Shelby American book you wrote, which is another great book. But at the end of the school, you get ballsy and you go up to Carroll and you ask for a job. The guy's basically like, here, kid, take a broom. And this is in that golden age of that place, around the Cobra and GT50 and the Daytona Coupe. And it led to you being offered this drive at very last minute at Sebring in a 427 Cobra. And you basically show up, you at one point you said something about, you're going to be the night watchman. Car gets damaged, they repair it, Ken Miles goes out, comes back in, there's nobody else to go in it, you get in it. And you're like, the way you write about it is just like, well, okay, hell, and you get in it, and some of it goes well and some of it doesn't. You're driving around Sebring at night. But looking back on stuff like that, those moments where, in retrospect, there's this ballsy kid taking a shot going, well, screw it. Do you look at that and wonder who was that guy, or is it still feel like you? I mean, because we process risk so differently as we get older, right?
Yeah, no, it is me. It was me. And I can identify with that person. And I never have been ballsy in that way. I just, it's what I'm supposed to do. So I do it. And I was given a goofy opportunity to drive that car. And that was the first time I'd ever been in a professional race. And it's the first time I'd ever driven a car that wasn't a Lotus Super 7 on a racetrack, other than the Cobra Coupe. I mean, the Cobra, the prototype I went to the school in, which was far from a healthy Cobra, although it did sell for $13 million later, about 5 years ago at auction. That race had a tremendous effect on me as I look back. It really didn't lead to much, I don't think. I did get to drive on the Cobra team a couple times with Miles. And the reason I got to is because Carroll Shelby happened. These are just happenstances that happened in my life, like Shelby coming out to test with Billy Krause, the first Cobra at Riverside, during the 1 week I went to his school. And so I asked him for a job because I was going to turn around and go back to Illinois, which is, Midwest, not the coast, but near Chicago. And so that was happenstance. And that my instructor was Peter Brock, totally happenstance. Because I didn't know Peter Brock from The Man in the Moon at that point. And then I'd raced for a summer, and I went back east, and when I came back to Shelby, you've read all this stuff, but Shelby went out to Willow Springs, which he never did. I mean, he did if he was racing as a driver, but he had no reason to go to Willow Springs except he wanted to see Ronnie Bucknam and evaluate him because he was going to give him a ride on the Cobra team. And I almost beat him in my Lotus, and I was the janitor, actually almost the janitor. So that's why I ended up getting to drive for him at all. And that was total happenstance that he came out to watch Ronnie Bucknam and he saw me.
We'll go back a sec, right? So you said you said something about not being a ballsy person. You just do what you have to do. But on some level, you have to know that jumping into a big block Cobra, 427 Cobra at a professional race at Sebring, no less, right? There's an element, like a lot of people wouldn't do that, John. I mean, that on some level, that is a ballsy thing to do. You may not think of yourself as a ballsy person, but like how in that moment, they say, all right, get in the car. Here, you can get in the car. Did you want to, or was it just
I was scared shitless, to be honest. I really was.
But
I had to do it because how could I say no? I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And they had to have a driver because Miles needed relief. He had cracked ribs from the accident.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like I was being a benevolent. It wasn't that I was being benevolent. I did it because Shelby asked if I could do it. And I said, yeah, I can. You know the track. Yeah, but I didn't know the track. But I didn't care. But that race is one of the most momentous races I've ever had in my life, even though I drove around for several hours with a car that was failing and finally blew up.
Right.
But, it was an initiation.
Okay. So when you got in the car, I don't remember. Was it dark? I want to say it was dark.
No, it was probably 3.5 hours into the race, 3 hours into the race. And Miles, every other car had 2 drivers. Miles was entered in that car with no spare because the year before the Cobras were breaking so regularly that the drivers just switched around. It didn't matter that there was 2 drivers per car. Yeah. So nothing broke. All the team cars were running perfectly, and Miles needed to get out, and they needed a warm body to get in, and there I was.
So wait. So if you're scared shitless when you got in the car, I mean, how long did it take for that to go away? It had to go away, right? I mean, it's a race car.
I've started enjoying it.
How long? A lap in? 10 laps in? What?
Well, not a lap, because the first lap I spun on 2 different corners that I'd never seen. But no, and I'm going to say 5, 6 laps, 7 laps. I started feeling.
Sorry.
No, I started feeling a little more at ease, even though the car was an awful car. I mean, it was a wreck. It was a bad car that was wrecked.
Repaired, right?
Yeah.
What went through your head in those spins? Do you remember?
Yeah, I remember thinking, they don't have any idea what my first lap time was going to be. So no big deal, because they couldn't see it. It was in the back. It was on the part of the track that they don't use anymore. It's just defined by hay bales out on the runway. And I thought nobody's going to know. And they didn't. I had to tell them.
Which on the one hand, you're like, okay, yeah, it's his first pro race and yada, yada, yada at Sebring. And on the other hand, you think it's the factory Cobra team at Sebring and you're in a 427 and this is like, it's just, when you start thinking about what's happening, the variables start to get funny.
Yeah.
Right? So one of the interesting things about, I've talked to a lot of professional drivers, both active and retired. And one of the interesting things about them is that, they all on some level, if they become well known for something, and so many of them do, right? A particular weekend, a moment, a record, they all end up having this regular life outside that, because racing drivers are not the kind of, even all the way up to, Hamilton and current F1 stars. There's always some place in the world they can go and just be a person, and where they're not signing autographs. And, sedan drivers, in America, race drivers are not celebrities. And you have this massive career. You raced from your time at Shelby all the way up to the turn of the century, basically from cars on treaded bias plies all the way up to, Le Mans. You've won the runoffs twice. You have class wins at Le Mans. You had this long and varied career with multiple high points. And yet you're one of the few drivers that people tend to remember for a very specific moment. And it's that Trans Am race at Laguna. it's held up as one of the greatest races in history. And you've talked about it probably a zillion times. And you know all the questions by heart. We don't have to go to it here. But when people bring that up, does it ever feel odd? Do you ever think on all of the other like remarkable things you did in a race car and wonder, why can't we talk about that? Why not all the rest of it?
Yeah,
I mean,
no, I do, because I think a lot of people, especially the Datsun people, and you're a Datsun person, I guess, kind of. And the thing about Datsun people is most of them don't know much about racing.
Yeah.
They only know about Datsuns.
Right.
And they know about, I mean, I don't mean Nissans, I mean Datsuns. They know that, period. And they don't know, they probably know who Sterling Moss was, but they don't have intimate knowledge of racing. Some of them surely do, but the most part, it's that period in racing history that they focus on. And I do too, for the simple reason that that was a high point for me.
Yeah.
It was one of the highest points, but it was not the highest point. It was, looking back, I'm proud of what happened on that team, and with the runoffs and the Trans Am championships. And yeah, I'm proud of that. But I raced a lot of Porsches too, and Ferraris and Jaguars and some Indy cars and sprint cars. So.
It's funny. You know, I'm a Datsun person, but I'm mostly a history person, right? You know, I spent a bunch of time at Road and Track. I spent a bunch of time in other car magazines. I love all of it. And the B Sedan stuff is interesting to me for what it was, but BRE is compelling in particular because of the people, right? The cars are great. 510's a neat thing. All the B Sedan stuff's neat, right? 510s, 2002s, GTVs, they're all cool. But BRE in particular was just this neat little collective of this little bubble in time that came out of a, you know, all this, but some people may not, that it came out of Shelby's shop, and how, you know, Shelby basically stole a Toyota racing deal out from under Pete. So Pete backed up and went Datsun, and then the Datsun arrangement ended up being what everyone remembers the team for. But the people are remarkable. You know, it's you, of course, and Pete, but also guys like, you know, Trevor Harris, who designed the Shadow Can-Am cars, and Mac Tilton, who founded Tilton Engineering, which, you know, ended up being brake supplier to everybody from club guys to Formula One. And just this huge moment where all these people were in the right place at the right time, and they ended up making this huge dent in the culture before going on to do other things. And the team disbanded it was 72, right?
Yeah, the end of 72. The last race the team ran as a team was the Baja 1000 that I drove with Peter Brock, and at the end of 72.
Which is this really cool thing. I want to ask you 1,000 questions about that. I have to shut up that voice in my head for. But so when the team disbanded, you know, talk to a lot of people who've done remarkable things in their lives, and they always have this moment where they do the remarkable thing. They're like, okay, cool, that's done. Now we move on to the other thing. Everything else is either going to be just as remarkable, or it's going to keep getting better, or, you know, at a bare minimum, this is what it was. This is where my life is now. When that whole thing came apart, or not came apart, but when it kind of shuttered, did anybody else in the team or you have any feeling that there was a moment that something great was ending, or was it just move on? And do you look at it differently now, I guess?
No, but I can look back on what I felt at the time.
Yeah.
And I still feel that way. That was a team, like you mentioned the name Trevor and Mac and John Caldwell, John Knepp, and some others were incredible people who went on and did other things too, were very successful. But this was their first major success, I think, or the high point of their lives up until that point, and certainly mine too. The thing I regret is I hung around in 73 working at Brock's because I needed a job.
What were you doing?
This nothing stuff. We weren't racing. Peter had put in a proposal to Schlitz beer to run a 5,000 car and buy 2 Lolas and run in the 5,000 series. And I was very up for that because that's really what I wanted to do at that time. And it fizzled. I mean, Peter didn't get the money, and he got, I think, kind of, distracted isn't fair, but he started getting on that hang glider kick. I still resent hang gliders for that reason, because that was kind of the end of BRE.
Yeah.
And the thing that I regret more than anything is that with the notoriety I had a lot of notoriety at this 2 years of the Trans Am and the national championships, because we're racing against the best of the club racers, Sharp and Tullius and Scoville, but that I couldn't put something together after that. How lame is that? Because
Sean?
No, it's lame that I couldn't just move into it, talk to. Yeah. I remember one time, the end of the second to the last race of the 72 season, we had obviously won the championship, and I won 5 races, and I beat all of the guest drivers, including Allison, and I mean, he was a great driver and a good friend, I was in a car that I knew like the back of my hand, and these guys are put in it, and they did, they were, except for Peter Gregg, they were easy to beat. But they wouldn't have, if they put me in the Coke Chevy, Allison's car, I would have been really easy to beat too,
right.
For him. But this, I'm the one that won those races, and there's a Can-Am team, shadow Can-Am team, Don Nichols shadow team. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Of course, yeah. Trevor,
The guy that got a chance to drive a shadow was Bobby Allison. I said, what about me? I beat Bobby Allison. I mean, and I didn't beat him in a fire breathing car like a NASCAR car or an Indy car. I beat him in a Datsun. So he got the chance to drive and then drive for Penske. And why didn't I fault my own personality or my own ability to make things happen for myself? I just wasn't good at it at that facet. So
you mentioned Pete and hang gliders. I know him a little. I got to know him a little bit when I was at Road and Track, and over breakfast one day, he gave me the whole story on how the hang gliding thing happened. He went down to I think it was the beach in LA, and he saw guys, leaping off the dunes, and got into it. And then all of a sudden there were, he was making them, and then there were distance records and guys in snowmobile suits going up in the high desert, for hours. And I just found it really interesting because he talked about walking away from racing, just like, And so much of this book, so much of Carrot is Sylvia talking about how, and painting pictures of how focused you were and how driven, how badly you wanted to be in open wheelers, and how in so many ways, even then, it was becoming clear that it may happen, it may not. And how did your head work when you realized, you started to realize that those doors were shutting? Because again, like you had a couple decades of significant career after that in sports cars and prototypes. The Group 44 Jags that you mentioned. You drove a 935 at Le Mans. You drove Vipers at Le Mans. I mean, big stuff. And yet that door was shut. How was it easy when you realized that door was shut, and the open wheel, the path was kind of closed, or did it always just kind of linger? How did you look at
that? The way I looked at it was I just did whatever I could do. And that I drove Indy cars. And I drove Indy cars that were not very good cars.
Right.
And I, it's part of my resume. I drove Indy cars, but I never won any. I did win an AIS race in an Eagle, but I wasn't really an IndyCar driver with any regularity.
Yeah.
And I would have preferred that over what I did do, but that didn't work. But the reason it worked at all is because somebody asked me if I'd drive their car at the Long Beach Grand Prix. I mean, I didn't solicit it. I didn't go out to try to get a ride. It just fell in my lap, that ride. And then I was going to run that car at Indianapolis, but I had to do the rookie test. And they didn't have it ready early enough to do the rookie test. It was a good car. It was like a year-old Eagle, but it was a good car. So they stuck Steve Krisaloff in it because he was already qualified. I mean, he was already an IndyCar driver, and he tried to qualify the car, and he probably would have, but he crashed and broke his leg in it. And then I drove for Jet Engineering and did some races for them. They really weren't competitive. And so I don't know for sure if I'd have ever been competitive. I think if I'd done it long enough with the right team. The thing about the BRE team that I think has been the most important thing for me is these were really good people. They were really the best, and they were all friends of mine, good friends. And they didn't want anybody else in the car. And they knew I was the best. In their minds, I was the best. And that, kind of gives you confidence. It gives you a lot of confidence. And I've never been on a team like that again.
Were you ever convinced you were the best, or was it just enough that they believed in you? Some drivers have to believe, right? They have to know they're the best, period, even if that.
I don't think I ever knew that. I had the pole in every race I ran in 1971. Yeah. And I never entered a race that I thought I'd win. That I really said, I got this one covered. And I did a lot of them. I did have covered. I was going to be able to win, but I never went into a race thinking I'm going to win this.
If I didn't know better, I'd say you had a Jewish mother like me. God, you sound like the voices in my head. I'm not very good at anything really. I'm not good. I
was good. I'm not saying I wasn't good. I was good. Yeah. I was good enough not to quit and do something worthwhile with my life.
But you realize how rare that approach is, or maybe you don't, right? I mean, again, at this point, I've probably talked to dozens and dozens, more than 100 pro drivers. And so many of them talk about how they get in the car and they have to, it doesn't matter whether they know they screwed up, whether they know the car isn't working, whether they know, what's against them. They have to, they put on the helmet, they close their eyes, you look out the windshield, you think, I am the absolute best in this grid, and it's just going to happen. So many people have to, like, that's how flow state happens. That's how they get themselves there. What you just said is, I've probably heard one or two other people who have driven professionally say it. It's rare, man. It's remarkable. But.
Yeah. Well, I've been at races usually long time ago. I mean, closer to the BRE period, maybe even before, and maybe a little after, when I was just hanging on by my knuckles to try to continue doing it, working for in a menial job, and still trying to race. But this is before BRE. Yeah. And I used to say, I'm the best driver at this track. And I probably wasn't good, but I tell myself that. And I probably was in a lot of cases, because this was club racing. And that's what I fell back on, because I didn't have enough money to go, to run. I ran the USRC and tried to in my own car, and I couldn't stand out because I didn't have a good enough car and I didn't have any money. Right. But I used to tell myself, when I was in those conditions, under those conditions, I'd tell myself, well, I'm better than all these other guys. I tell myself that. I don't think I necessarily believed it, but
yeah. One of you've alluded to this a couple of times, and you mentioned something about it earlier too, but One of the things I find really interesting about your career and the way you talk about racing is that you're just blatantly honest with it. You talked about being not very good at selling, right? Which now these days is, if you can't sell, you're not in the car. Nobody gets in a car on merit anymore, unless you're Juan Pablo, right? Like it's a handful of people, and even then, they're not. It's dicey, but so many. There's a quote that I wrote down. I was looking at Carrot a couple of days ago, just kind of researching for this and thinking about stuff. And the middle papers it's all photographs with little captions underneath.
Mm.
One of the captions, there's a picture of you in actually the car that's on the cover.
That's
car,
right? The Carrot.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So there's a quote underneath it that, forgive me, I hate having my words read back to me, but I'm going to do it to you because I've got the mic. But you said, I got a feeling for the kind of inertia that the car and I had at that speed. And I realized that if we came into contact with one of those trees, we'd be reduced to a pulp. And yet, you've alluded to risk a little. And yet, there were moments where you drove significantly faster stuff. I mean, a 935 is not, even the late ones, the Kramer cars are not safe cars. Like a Group C car, people died in them, and people were still getting hurt at Le Mans on up in the 90s, and you were running there. Like, how did you are not the kind of guy, and forgive me, you do not seem like the kind of guy who can simply tell a voice in your head to shut up. And so much of what's in Carrot is talking about, how you process stuff and how you thought about stuff, and especially how you thought about driving insecurities and safety and 1,000 other things. Mm-hmm. How did you, as you kept driving faster and faster things, how did you put that away? How did you, as the cars got faster and a little bit safer, but mostly just faster, how did your approach to that sort of thing change, or did you always just kind of have that voice in the back of your head?
No, I don't think I did. I mean, I had an awareness that it was a dangerous sport back then. It isn't very dangerous anymore. It almost seems like it's, no more, it's not as dangerous as football now, but it was in the beginning. And it's, from the onset of the thought of driving cars fast and against one another goes back to the 1890s, I guess. It's been extremely dangerous, and it gradually, almost suddenly got safe when they said, we got to stop killing people. We're going to change the tracks. We're going to change the cars. And it changed. It changed the sport. The thing about that comment you just read back, that was the feeling I got the first time I drove that car on a track that had trees, because it's going so fast. I'd never, a Datsun 510, a Z car, even the 427 Cobra. There's a feeling of vulnerability you get, and you just have to get comfortable with it. Yeah. And now I don't think you have to worry about that so much. But back then the only other time maybe not the only other time, but one other time it hit me was at Le Mans, where I'd never been there. I always wanted to race there. I played board game with it when I was a kid, where you roll the dice and move the car. And now I'm really there in a 935. This is 1979, and going down that straight, because it didn't have the chicanes then.
Right.
And I thought, holy crap, this is fast, because it's a 2-lane highway. But I got used to it. I got used to it, and then actually it's a place you can kind of rest a little bit.
Yeah.
But you just accept it. You just say, I know it's dangerous, and I don't want to dwell on it. I just doing it because that's what I do.
One of the things I find really interesting about guys like you, whose career started in the skinny tire era and ended in the intense downforce era, it's such a massive spread of speed and capability. And Hurley Haywood told me once, I think you actually drove with him in the Group 44 cars in one of the prototypes, right? The Jags.
We drove with him in the 87 season.
Yeah.
And
he told,
yeah,
sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. Yeah. I drove with him in 87,
He told me once that the whole process, and this is Hurley, right? Who is like famously, just to the point, direct about things. And then if you ask a dumb question, we'll look at you and not answer it with the look on his face that says you have asked a dumb question. We're moving on. But he told me once that the whole process of getting used to significantly faster cars every few years, because he followed the same arc, right? He started in the 60s and ended in Group C cars and, Le Mans stuff around the turn of the century. But he told me that getting used to significantly faster cars every time, and the reason we were talking about it specifically because it was a Ren Sport. We were standing next to one of the 917s, the Can-Am cars, the 1,000 horsepower nasty turbo things. And he said that it was always really interesting, but he also tried not to think about it because he always had that voice in the back of his head saying that, you might not be able to do this. And he had to shut the voice up because he had to pay attention to the car and think about it. Did you, with each of those leaps, as the cars got noticeably faster, right? A 935 is a massively quick thing. It is not like any of the stuff you were in before. And again, the prototypes after that. Did you ever have to stop and consciously process, you mentioned hanging on earlier, but process what the car needs and think about it? Or is it just kind of boom, 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 we're in it, we're doing it. Okay, here. How did that process work for you?
Well, yeah, I can use an example that most people don't even know about. I had a guy I had no interest whatsoever in drag racing, never been on a drag strip. And a guy at Shelby's, along with two other guys, built a AA fuel dragster. And I have a friend of mine, it's all, this is all written somewhere, asked, why don't you let John drive it? And I caught a $10 bill or a $2, whatever it was. And because my reactions were, he said, well, your reactions are fast enough, but I wasn't trying to get
he actually made you do the dollar bill thing.
Yeah. Because my friend said, John, let John drive it. You ought to have John drive it. And I was at Shelby's. I had no experience, very little racing experience at that time. And so he pulls out, he was going to say, see, fast, you're not quick enough to drive a dragster. So I caught the bill that Bob Skinner dropped several times. And so he said, well, you're fast enough. And then they went through a bunch of drivers when they started and they'd fire him. And one of them was became a very famous driver. Mike Sorokin. Okay. And he won big races with them. They weren't a winning team. And he came to me one day. He was a machinist. Skinner was the machinist who owned the car, built the car. And he said, you still want to drive our car? And I never said I wanted to drive it. I just caught this bill that he dropped. It wasn't because I wanted to drive a dragster. Anyway, I said, yeah, I guess so. So I drove his car for 3 weeks, a AA fuel dragster. Now that was fast because I'd never driven anything but the Lotus and then the 427 at Sebring.
Did you like it? Were you good at it?
What was it like? Yeah, well, I think I could have been good at it. I didn't no knowledge of it. I didn't know how you did it. I mean, it's easy to do. I went and sat in the garage where the car was and practiced the routine of shutting the fuel. I can't remember the order now. First thing you do is pop the chute and then, let off the throttle, pop the chute, start working the Oldsmobile drum brakes in the back and turn off the mag. And I practice doing that because if you wait too long, you're gone 190 miles an hour and you have to start stopping. But I did it for 3 weeks and it was okay. I mean, I didn't have any desire to do it anymore. And I left for New York to race my Lotus. Yeah. So I never went back. And then they went through some more drivers and finally got back to Sorokin and they became stars. They were called the Surfers.
Was that one of those moments where you're like, screw it, I just need to do it? But was there ever, I mean, You said you didn't really like it and you didn't want to do it again, but like, was there a part of you that kind of liked it, or does it just, here's the opportunity, fine, right?
I'm glad I did it because it's something that most people haven't experienced.
Yeah.
It was something I knew when I got into it. This is going to be kind of stupid. I'm doing something that I'm not even very interested in,
Yeah.
but I'm doing it with friends, and I don't know. Doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
It was just something I did because there it was. It was an offer. It wasn't exactly.
Go ahead.
It wasn't exactly going over Niagara Falls in a barrel, but it was the unknown, a AA fuel dragster, complete unknown. So, I just did what came up.
It's funny how many people's arcs have it, whether it's a pivotal moment or not, right? And sometimes it's more remarkable when that moment is pivotal, but so many moments where people get to do remarkable things or have remarkable opportunities, and it's just because they were in the right place and it's here, and they had, they didn't necessarily want to do it, they did not want to do it, it was just there. I mean, you mentioned friends, and you talked earlier about BRE, and you said you got in the top fuel car with friends, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that was with friends, and BRE, you got to be friends with or were friends with so many of those people. How common is it? So many teams are built around one critical person who then leads the charge for everybody, or is a talent, just a talent gatherer like Shelby was, right? Or in Pete's case, he was a little bit of Shelby, and he was a little bit of kind of the the Harry Miller mold of kind of an engineer, kind of a driver, kind of can do a marketer, could do a little bit of everything. And how often did you see teams that worked that well? You said you never saw anything that worked as well, but how often did you come across groups of people that functioned like that? And if you ever did, what kept them together? What made them work?
It's a hard one to answer. I was on some good teams other than the BRE team. I was on Jim Busby's team driving 962 Porsches, and did Lola Mazda at Le Mans. I was on Bob Tullius's team.
Yeah.
I was on the Electromotive Nissan team.
Right.
All top teams. But I think looking back, I was a player on those teams. I wasn't the guy on any of them. I was one of, 2 or 3 drivers, or 2 in some cases. But I just never had the feeling that I had with the BRE team. It never could happen again. I don't think I'd ever. I mean, well, it's not going to happen again now, but I don't think it ever did. The closest probably was the Tullius's, the Jaguar team.
So Tullius's, I mean, you mentioned Tullius and Busby, and these are massive names and guys known for building organizations that operated a certain way. What did somebody like Tullius have in common with Pete? Because everything you read on the surface, they're deeply different people, and yet they're still approaching the same problem and the same kinds of failures and the same kinds of things coming apart in the same way at the end of the day, right? Do you have anything in common with Peter?
Who, Tullius?
Tullius, or Busby for that matter. I mean, what did any of those 3 guys have in common?
The one thing, I just went to a party last Saturday at Busby's, and it was celebrating his 50 years in racing. He had made his race shop into a museum, and it was spectacular. And that isn't Peter, but it isn't Tullius either. But all 3 of those people demanded excellence and recognized it, and they were able to do something that I couldn't do, because I could see it, but I didn't. They had a had a gift for running a race team. Al Holbert had a gift for running a race team. I tried to run my own race team, and I'd be driving in a Can-Am car thinking, how am I going to get this engine to the airport after the race? And I thought, that's just not the way you deal with running a team. And I just wasn't cut out to do that, even though I tried to do it. But those guys had a gift for putting people together and, demanding excellence and getting rid of people that I had to fire a guy once on my Can-Am team, and I sweated all night over, how am I going to get rid of this guy? And the guy was dangerous. I mean, he'd leave stuff loose, and I thought this is going to be traumatic for me to fire somebody. And it kind of was.
Okay. So you say that all three of those guys demanded excellence. What were they like when they didn't get it? And I don't mean like, you're fired, you're out of here, screw it. But how did they react when things went, tits up?
I don't know what I'm allowed to say on this show.
It's my show and you're John Morton and I'm holding your book. You can say anything you want.
Well, they kind of turned into assholes.
Was it useful assholism, or was it like counterproductive?
No, it was useful because that's the way they were wired.
Okay.
They were very demanding, and they expected you to be demanding too.
You don't seem like the kind of person who could turn into an asshole, John.
No, I couldn't. That's why I had so much trouble firing a guy. No, I wasn't capable of being that way, because I'm not that kind of. I'm not defaulting Peter or Tullius or Busby. That's how you run a successful operation, and they did. So, and the Nissan team too. Yeah.
So when you realized you weren't get out of it, you said you couldn't do it, but you could see it. But you did try. How early in that process did you realize you weren't a good fit for running a team when you ran your own team?
Probably in 1981.
So how soon was that after you started?
I had raced my own car. Sylvia and I bought a Lola.
Yeah.
And that's another story, long story. We ended up buying a Lola and running it as a Can-Am car in 77. And in 80
years. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, from 77 and then till 81, I actually had a sponsor. I had never had a real sponsor of any consequence. And I had a sponsor who became a really good friend. And I got him into racing. He was interested in racing, but he wasn't in it. He had a vintage car and he admired racers. And so he said, I can't, a mutual friend hooked me up with him, had a meeting. And he said, he wasn't a friend yet. He was just a guy I was trying to get sponsorship from. And he said, I'll do whatever I can to help you. I'll write letters, but the most money I could ever spend out of my pocket is $5,000. And I'm thinking, well, thank you, but I thought that's useless. $5,000. I didn't say that, and I didn't give that impression, I don't think, but he ended up getting way into it, owned his own racing team. But first he sponsored my team, the Can-Am team. And so I had an obligation to a sponsor. And we had a series of engine failures from a legitimate engine builder that wasn't our fault. And I felt so guilty. I'd taken this guy's money and I'm doing a poor job. And it just didn't sit well with me. He ended up spending, the $5,000 turned into probably in excess of $1 million, because he said, I want to have my own team. So I'm sponsoring you, but you can drive for my team. So he bought a Lola, Lola GTP car and then a march. And then he had Michael Andretti driving. He had John Paul Jr. driving. He had me driving. He had Whitney Gans driving, a whole bunch of drivers.
Yeah.
And never won a race. And I've caused this poor guy, he wasn't poor, he was a wealthy guy, but I caused money though, right? He spent a lot of money because I talked him into getting into racing. So I always felt a little guilty about it.
See, that's really interesting. I've again talked to a lot of team managers, talked to a lot of guys who, spent a lot of other people's money in racing. Most of them don't have that moment where they're like, I felt guilty that things didn't go well. We spent his money. They were just like, oh yeah, we spent his money. And we need to find more money. That's
well,
that
yeah,
gene in particular may not have been useful.
I mean, there are things about me that were not cut out to do that.
I think it makes you a better person, so I wouldn't stress about it too much. But
yeah, well, better people don't necessarily win the Indy 500.
Right.
I mean, they're not bad people either, and I'm not making that judgment at all.
Not to disparage anybody. I more meant like you know what I meant. So. Yeah. So, okay,
the nice guys finish last. There's something to that.
Right. So about 10 years ago, you have such an interesting eye on how things work when they don't go well, right? So about 10 years ago, you famously, you won the runoffs twice in the 1970s. And 10 years ago, you went back. It was the 50th anniversary. There was this deal where, because it was the 50th anniversary, the runoffs are, for people who don't know, they're basically the Olympics sort of amateur motor racing.
Yeah.
And you have to qualify for it. And you were allowed to go back, like a handful of other people, past champions were allowed to go back without running the qualifying races and accruing the points. And you went back in a 240Z that had been prepped by some friends, and it wasn't perfect. You did remarkably well given the circumstances. It's a hell of a tough event. It gets tougher every year. People spend an insane amount of money in club racing terms to go win the thing. And you didn't get a lot of time in the car. There was bad weather. It didn't go particularly great. You did well given what you had, but so much in road racing hangs, it's like we talked earlier, on car and circumstance. And so much of the process of running a team or being a driver is planning to try and minimize the chances of other things you can't control going wrong, right? When you went back after so much time out of A, club racing, and B, you had essentially retired, roughly a decade before, did you approach it any differently after kind of being a stint as a normal person? Or was it just a case of shifting back into the same mental gear? And by approach, I mean things not going right in the car. And, so much of racing is bad luck, right?
Yeah. I wasn't happy with my performance, but it rained most of the practice days. So I got very little time in the car, and the car was not a BRE car. I mean, it just wasn't. It was, they worked hard and they made it look good, and they did a good job, and the engine was good, I guess. It was a whole different set of rules. The classes it was a different sort of setup for what they called e-production, I think then. No, I wasn't happy with it, and I don't think I drove that well. And why I don't know. I hadn't been doing it. I'd just been running I've run a lot of vintage races until just very recently, but I don't know, but I was very disappointed, partly in the way I drove and partly in the way I felt about it and partly in the car.
I've done a bit of club racing, and I'm one of those people that sits there in the car, and when I make a mistake, even if that mistake, I can look down at the box and the mistake cost me 2 tenths or whatever, I look down at the mistake and I think about that mistake too long, and then that causes more mistakes. And then I dwell on that. And then I get out of the car and I spend a lot of time thinking things about how many mistakes I'm making. And when you said you drove poorly, when that happens, because there are weekends I've gotten out of the car and then known things didn't go well, and then kind of analyzed it a week or two later and realized that things went worse than I thought, and I was not doing what I should have been for a bunch of reasons. Did you know in the car when it wasn't, that you weren't getting out of yourself what you needed, or did that take time to set in?
But I had never driven the car before at all.
Really? You didn't test it or anything?
No.
Wow.
No, just drove it there. And the guys worked hard. They made a big deal out, painted it like a BRE car. And I love the track. I love Elkhart Lake. It just, I don't know. It's just one of those things that very little practice time, knowing what the car could do and understanding it is something that I didn't know. I mean, I did it with the 427 Cobra, but that was 50, 60 years before, whatever it was. Right. But it's, I don't beat myself up over it, because I know I could have done better if I'd had, a proper team that I had worked with for a while.
Yeah. And which is not to disparage those guys, but it's just how it works.
No,
right?
No, I'm not disparaging them, because the race was won by a 240Z.
Yeah. So it's so interesting, right? Because there is so much that separates club racing from pro racing, and yet they are no different on so many levels. And those levels are really the things that come down to the things that don't have anything to do with money, right? It's all about the stuff you can't control, and the fact that you can, like Le Mans, right? You went to Le Mans something like 9 times between 79 and 98, and I wrote down that, forgive me if I get this wrong, you were on the podium 3 times, but you also DNF'd 3 times, right? Your team did, and there were a bunch of different.
The first time in the 935, the engine blew up halfway through the race.
Right.
Not when I was driving it, but doesn't matter who was driving it. Ted Fields owned the car, and he and Milt Minner were the co-drivers. And then the next 2 years I drove a Ferrari, a North American racing team, and we would have won at least one of those. And one of the drivers crashed late in the race, and the next year the transmission started packing up, and so we still finished 9th overall, but we would have won our class had it not happened. But so these aren't DNFs like horrible DNFs. They're painful.
Yeah. But it still happens. So does that feeling ever get easier, or is it always just, we were in it and now I'm carrying my gear back to the rental car and now we are not in it? Like, does it ever change, or is it always the same thing?
There are races that are more painful than others, looking back. And they don't have to be important races. They were just important to you, or to me in this case. I still agonize. I mean, when I say agonize, I'm not talking about I don't really lose sleep over it. But a go-kart race I ran in 1960.
Are you serious? That's amazing. That's so great. It's so great.
Yeah, I still agonize over that, because I never was in a competitive kart at this time, and they had a big Labor Day race, and I happened to start in the front for some reason. I can't remember if we drew straws or whatever, and I just pulled away from the field. And my chain came off, and could have won that race. But my chain.
I mean, it's worth thinking about now. It's seriously, it's important we relitigate this stuff.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
I'm just using an absurd example of, of something that I never totally gotten over.
Right. I remember
okay. I'm over the go-kart race. Okay.
I had I was in middle school. I never spent any time in karts. I didn't get into club racing until after college, when I basically,
Mhm.
did really dumb things like sell my couch to buy tires, and basically
Yeah.
got a season and a half of in a very uncompetitive car, and then ran completely out of money, and the whole other thing. But I tested a cart in, I want to say it was middle school or something. So a friend of a friend's dad had a cart and he put it in me, and I remember sitting in the thing, and the track had a handful of lefts and a handful of rights, and the cart, for whatever reason, carts are like setups crazy complex in carts, even as simple as it is. And the cart turned really, really well to the left, and it turned extremely poorly to the right. It was massive understeer. And I remember getting out of it and thinking, I must not be good at right turns. This must be me. This must be
Yeah.
my fault.
Yeah.
And then, until for 10 years, until I like actually started learning how the sport works, it stuck with me. And it was like, oh, that is my weak point. I'm awful. It's just, stuff sticks in your head. It's funny, but so I don't know.
You should have been an oval track driver then, because they're good at left turns.
So a lot of one of the things that I kind of want to end, and we're almost out of time, but a lot of drivers don't ever get tired of it, right? They retire, they keep going back. Guys like Tony Stewart or Robbie Gordon, who just you cannot keep them out of a car. I think like Tony Stewart just started drag racing, right? And the reason he gave literally weeks ago, and the reason he gave was something like, well, I'm too old for IndyCar, and NASCAR makes me angry, and I want to keep doing something at the top level, and I'm fat. So this is the reason, this is what I can do. But some guys are flipped, right? They get out of it and they are hard done. They just don't have any interest in doing it anymore.
Yeah.
And you obviously still enjoy being in a car, and historic stuff is fun, but that's different from going wheel to wheel for tenths in a club environment or in a pro environment. Do you miss that? Do you have any desire to scratch that itch again? I mean, set aside whether you could or couldn't, right? Is that a thing you would do if you could?
Yeah, I would. But at my age, it's foolhardy to think you could compete with a young person. I'm 80 years old.
Oh, of course.
But the reason, I guess, people say, why did you race, or why did you do it? Why did you choose that? And I kind of jokingly say, because I've avoided work my whole life. So I played for a living in a way, but they all think they think it's fun to do that. It isn't much fun to race. It's fun to race after you won, right. But the actual act is probably not fun to be in an NFL game and get your ass kicked.
Right.
And racing, it's too serious to be fun at the top level. At the higher levels, it's not really fun.
Until you got to the too serious to be fun thing, I was going to say you would have made a really good writer, because it's not really any fun when you're doing it, and everybody likes having written, but nobody likes writing.
Yeah,
and you have a decent degree of self-loathing, so you would have made a great journalist.
I don't think I have exactly self-loathing.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. You know what I meant. I'm sorry.
Yeah. But as far as writing goes, I did write a book. I would have never written a book. I never wanted to. And a guy asked me, he asked Sylvia to write a book on Shelby, not a book, a story for a magazine. And she said, I didn't know Shelby well enough. You could ask John, maybe he'll try it. And so he did. And I said, I'll give it a shot. I don't know how to write a story, but I wrote the story.
Yeah.
And it came out in a magazine that you probably never even heard of, called American Driver. It was a nice glossy magazine.
Okay.
And it was a story on Carroll Shelby. And about a month, maybe 2 months later, after it had come out, a guy who was the editor, publisher at Motor Books, emailed me that I just read a story you wrote in an American Driver, and I really enjoyed it, and I wondered if could expand it into a book. And I said no. I said I live with a writer. I'm not gonna go through that. But he tried to talk me into it, and then he said, "Well, could you just do a quick outline what you do if you did write a book. So I wrote down, I literally 25 minutes, I sketched out 6 chapters. I do this, that, and then sent it to him. And he said, looks good now. I just got to find the money. And almost over 2 years went by, and I thought, great, I'm not going to write a stupid book. And then he said, we're ready to go on the Shelby book if you'll do it. And he paid me to do it. I mean, I got paid.
It's a good book. You did a nice job with it. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Well, I'm proud that I did it, and I actually enjoyed doing it. So it wasn't, because all I did was write my life story, kind of, and some observations. I couldn't, like what Sylvia does, just make something up and write a novel, even though they're predicated on, her own experiences. But not the carrot. That was journalism, really, more than.
It's funny having, I'm a writer for a living and a racer by hobby, but it's funny how much the parts of my brain that require me to look at something I've done and go, that is not good enough. You have to pull it apart and figure out why.
Mm-hmm.
It turned out to be very useful in the car. The part that isn't is the whole, neurotic, self-analytical, pull apart, sarcastic, I don't like myself thing. But it's funny how much intersection there is. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I know a lot of people have written books who hate the process, but
Sylvia does. She hates the process. I mean, she's miserable when she's doing it. I mean, but it's something she had to do. Like I had to race and she had to write books.
Right.
And now I'm 80 and she's 82. And we both know we're not going to write she's not going to write a lot more books, and I'm not going to do a lot more racing. And you just say, okay, so what now? Wait to die.
Come on.
And I don't mean it quite like that, but I'm trying to put it in the context of your life. When you stop doing what you do, like if you're a writer, when you stop writing, unless you just get sick of it. But if you want to keep doing it and you get to the point where you feel like you can't do it anymore, or the opportunities to do it aren't there. You have a reckoning, sort of.
It's interesting. I never thought about the she has to thing, right? There's a line in writing that, a lot of college and high school counselors tend to spit out. Mine did. And then I found out a couple of years later, it's actually it's a cliche, it's a trope. But the line is something like, if you can do literally anything else, do it. If you should only write if you have to. If you can't, not. And I'm one of those people that, like, there's a button in my brain and I have to push it. I have to do it. I have to get that and get the pellet. And if I write, I feel better. And now that you mention it, I've met a lot of drivers who are the same way, right? I club race because I love it, but if I didn't get to do it for the rest of my life, I would probably find something else. I'd be sad.
Yeah.
So many drivers who end up with real careers have just, they have that button. They have to do it.
Well, Sylvia was a creative writing professor, and she would try to let her students know that they should find some other line of work because they're doomed to,
say it. Yeah.
They're doomed to failure and unhappiness. And she knew, because she's been doing it. Yeah. She started her first book when she was 13 years old, and she's working on one upstairs right now.
But I mean, it's the same thing with racing, right?
It's the same.
Not by the odds, everybody's going to lose except, one person in the field. I mean, I never thought about it like that. That's so funny. Maybe that's why I like it. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, John, we've got time for one more thing. There's a thing we do at the end of every episode with everybody. It's just one question, mainly because the answer always says a lot about, who you are and how you see the world. So I'm going to ask you one question. Don't think too much, and just spit out an answer. Sound good?
Just what?
I'm just going to ask you one question.
Yeah.
Don't think too much. Just spit out an answer. Does that sound okay?
Okay.
Okay. What's the first thing that goes through your head when things go wrong?
That's a
It could be a 4-letter word.
oh yeah. Yeah. Shit.
Fair enough. Yeah.
I did a thing similar to what you're doing after I had that accident in the Scarab at Monterey.
That was 10, 12 years ago, right? Or no, longer ago?
It was 2010, I think.
You rolled it, right?
Yeah, several times.
Man.
And it's perfect again. And I've tested it since, but it's not going to race anymore. I don't. So things worth millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah.
But the one thing a guy asked me, somebody, the subject came up, what will be your last word? And I said, well, when that happened, I said shit. And so I guess that at that point, that was going to be my last word, but I survived. Right. So it wasn't.
Well, on that note, I think we're out of time. Thank you, John. Okay. This has been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Well, I enjoyed it. It's fun.
Thanks.
It's also easy. You just sit here and talk.